Closing in, Marines in the Seizure of Iwo Jima by Joseph H. Alexander. Sunday, 4 March 1945 marked the end of the second week of the U.S. invasion of Iwo Jima. By this point, the assault elements of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions were exhausted, their combat efficiency reduced to dangerously low levels. The thrilling sight of the American flag being raised by the 28th Marines on Mount Suribachi had occurred 10 days earlier. A lifetime on Sulphur Island. The landing forces of the 5 Amphibious Corps, VAC, had already sustained 13,000 casualties, including 3,000 dead. The front lines were a jagged serration across Iwo's fat northern half, still in the middle of the main Japanese defenses. Ahead the going seemed all uphill against a well-disciplined, rarely visible enemy. In the center of the island, the 3rd Marine Division units had been up most of the night repelling a small but determined Japanese counterattack which had found the seam between the 21st and 9th Marines. Vicious close combat had cost both sides heavy casualties. The counterattack spoiled the division's preparations for a morning advance. Both regiments made marginal gains against very stiff opposition. To the east, the 4th Marine Division had finally captured Hill 382, ending its long exposure in the amphitheater, but combat efficiency had fallen to 50%. It would drop another 5 points by nightfall. On this day, the 24th Marines, supported by flame tanks, advanced a total of 100 yards, pausing to detonate more than a ton of explosives against enemy cave positions in that sector. The 23rd and 25th Marines entered the most difficult terrain yet encountered, broken ground that limited visibility to only a few feet. Along the western flank, the 5th Marine Division had just seized Nishi Ridge and Hill 362B the previous day, suffering more than 500 casualties. It too had been up most of the night engaging a sizable force of infiltrators. The Sunday morning attacks lacked coordination, reflecting the division's collective exhaustion. Most rifle companies were at half strength. The net gain for the day, the division reported, was practically nil. But the battle was beginning to take its toll on the Japanese garrison as well. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi knew his 109th Division had inflicted heavy casualties on the attacking Marines, yet his own losses had been comparable. The American capture of the key hills in the main defense sector the day before deprived him of his invaluable artillery observation sites. His brilliant chief of artillery, Colonel Chosaku Kaido, lay dying. On this date, Kuribayashi moved his own command post from the central highlands to a large cave on the northwest coast. The usual blandishments from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo reached him by radio that afternoon. But Kuribayashi was in no mood for heroic rhetoric. "Send me air and naval support and I will hold the island," he signaled. "Without them, I cannot hold." That afternoon the fighting men of both sides witnessed a harbinger of Iwo Jima's fate. Through the overcast skies appeared a gigantic silver bomber, the largest aircraft anyone had ever seen. It was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, Dynamite, crippled in a raid over Tokyo, seeking an emergency landing on the island's scruffy main airstrip. As the Americans in the vicinity held their breaths, the big bomber swooped in from the south, landed heavily, clipped a field telephone pole with a wing, and shuddered to a stop less than 50 feet from the bitter end of the strip. Pilot Lieutenant Fred Mallow and his 10-man crew were extremely glad to be alive, but they didn't stay long. Every Japanese gunner within range wanted to bag this prize. Mechanics made field repairs within a half hour. Then the 65-ton Superfort lumbered aloft through a hail of enemy fire and headed back to its base in Tinian. The Marines cheered. The Battle of Iwo Jima would rage on for another 22 days, claiming 11,000 more American casualties and the lives of virtually the entire Japanese garrison. This was a colossal fight between two well-armed, veteran forces, the biggest and bloodiest battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps. From the 4th of March on, however, the leaders of both sides entertained no doubts as to the ultimate outcome. Assault preparations. Iwo Jima was one of those rare amphibious landings where the assault troops could clearly see the value of the objective. They were the first ground units to approach within 1,000 miles of the Japanese homeland, and they were participating directly in the support of the strategic bombing campaign. The latter element represented a new wrinkle on an old theme. For 40 years, the U.S. Marines had been developing the capability for seizing advanced naval bases in support of the fleet. Increasingly in the Pacific War, and most especially at Saipan, Tinian, and now Iwo Jima, they were seizing advanced air bases to further the strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands. American servicemen had awaited the coming of the B-29s for years. The very long-range bombers, which had become operational too late for the European War, had been striking mainland Japan since November 1944. Results proved disappointing. The problem stemmed not from the pilots or planes, but rather from a vexing little spit of volcanic rock lying halfway along the direct path from Saipan to Tokyo, Iwo Jima. Iwo's radar gave the Japanese defense authorities 2 hours advance notice of every B-29 strike. Japanese fighters based on Iwo swarmed up to harass the unescorted superforts going in and especially coming home, picking off those bombers crippled by anti-aircraft AA fire. As a result, the B-29s had to fly higher along circuitous routes with a reduced payload. At the same time, enemy bombers based on Iwo often raided B-29 bases in the Marianas, causing some damage. The Joint Chiefs of Staff decided Iwo Jima must be captured and a U.S. airbase built there. This would eliminate Japanese bombing raids and the early warning interceptions, provide fighter escorts throughout the most dangerous portion of the long B-29 missions, and enable greater payloads at longer ranges. Iwo Jima in American hands would also provide a welcome emergency field for crippled B-29s returning from Tokyo. It would also protect the flank of the pending invasion of Okinawa. In October 1944, the Joint Chiefs directed Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, CINC-PAC, to seize and develop Iwo Jima within the ensuing 3 months. This launched Operation Detachment. The first enemy in the campaign would prove to be the island itself, an ugly, barren, foul-smelling chunk of volcanic sand and rock, barely 10 square miles in size. Iwo Jima means Sulphur Island in Japanese. As described by one Imperial Army staff officer, the place was an island of sulfur, no water, no sparrow, no swallow. Less poetic American officers saw Iwo's resemblance to a pork chop, with the 556-foot dormant volcano Mount Suribachi dominating the narrow southern end, overlooking the only potential landing beaches. To the north, the land rose unevenly onto Motoyama Plateau, falling off sharply along the coasts into steep cliffs and canyons. The terrain in the north represented a defender's dream. Broken, convoluted, cave-dotted, a jungle of stone. Wreathed by volcanic steam, the twisted landscape appeared ungodly, almost moon-like. More than one surviving Marine compared the island to something out of Dante's Inferno. Forbidding Iwo Jima had 2 redeeming features in 1945. The military value of its airfields and the psychological status of the island as a historical possession of Japan. Iwo Jima lay in Japan's inner vital defense zone and was in fact administered as part of the Tokyo Prefecture. In the words of one Japanese officer, Iwo Jima is the doorkeeper to the imperial capital. Even by the slowest aircraft, Tokyo could be reached in 3 flight hours from Iwo. In the battle for Iwo Jima, a total of 28,000 Americans and Japanese would give their lives in savage fighting during the last winter months of 1945. No one on the American side ever suggested that taking Iwo Jima would be an easy proposition. Admiral Nimitz assigned this mission to the same team which had prevailed so effectively in the earlier amphibious assaults in the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the Expeditionary Forces, and Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill, commanding the attack force. Spruance added the highly regarded Rear Admiral William H. P. Blandy, a veteran of the Peleliu-Angkor landings, to command the amphibious support forces, responsible for minesweeping, underwater demolition team operations, and preliminary naval air and gun bombardment. As usual, maintaining unremitting military pressure on the enemy meant an accelerated planning schedule and an overriding emphasis on speed of execution. The amphibious task force preparing to assault Iwo Jima soon found itself squeezed on both ends. Hill and Blandy had a critical need for the amphibious ships, landing craft, and shore bombardment vessels currently being used by General Douglas MacArthur in his reconquest of Luzon in the Philippines. But bad weather and stiff enemy resistance combined to delay completion of that operation. The Joint Chiefs reluctantly postponed D-Day for Iwo Jima from 20 January 1945 until 19 February. The tail end of the schedule provided no relief. D-Day for Okinawa could go no later than 1 April because of the approach of the monsoon season. The constricted time frame for Iwo would have grave implications for the landing force. The experienced 5 Amphibious Corps under Major General Harry Schmidt, USMC, would provide the landing force an unprecedented assembly of 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Schmidt would have the distinction of commanding the largest force of U.S. Marines ever committed in a single battle, a combined force which eventually totaled more than 80,000 men. Well above half of these Marines were veterans of earlier fighting in the Pacific. Realistic training had prepared the newcomers well. The troops assaulting Iwo Jima were arguably the most proficient amphibious forces the world had seen. Unfortunately, 2 senior Marines shared the limelight for the Iwo Jima battle, and history has often done both an injustice. Spruance and Turner prevailed upon Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, then commanding Fleet Marine Forces Pacific, to participate in Operation Detachment as Commanding General, Expeditionary Troops. This was a gratuitous billet. Schmidt had the rank, experience, staff, and resources to execute corps-level responsibility without being second-guessed by another headquarters. Smith, the amphibious pioneer and veteran of landings in the Aleutians, Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, admitted to being embarrassed by the assignment. "My sun had almost set by then," he stated. "I think they asked me along only in case something happened to Harry Schmidt." Smith tried to keep out of Schmidt's way, but his subsequent decision to withhold commitment of the 3rd Marines, the Expeditionary Troops Reserve, remains as controversial today as it was in 1945. Holland Smith was an undeniable asset to the Iwo Jima campaign. During the top-level planning stage, he was often, as always, a voice in the wilderness, predicting severe casualties unless greater and more effective preliminary naval bombardment was provided. He diverted the press and the visiting dignitaries from Schmidt, always providing realistic counterpoints to some of the rosier staff estimates. "It's a tough proposition," Smith would say about Iwo. "That's why we are here." General Schmidt, whose few public pronouncements left him saddled with the unfortunate prediction of a 10-day conquest of Iwo Jima, came to resent the perceived role Holland Smith played in post-war accounts, as he would forcibly state, "I was the commander of all troops on Iwo Jima at all times. Holland Smith never had a command post ashore, never issued a single order ashore, never spent a single night ashore. Isn't it important from an historical standpoint that I commanded the greatest number of Marines ever to be engaged in a single action in the entire history of the Marine Corps?" General Smith would not disagree with those points. Smith provided a useful role, but Schmidt and his exceptional staff deserve maximum credit for planning and executing the difficult and bloody battle of Iwo Jima. The 5 Amphibious Corps achievement was made even more memorable by the enormously difficult opposition provided by the island and the enemy. In Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, see sidebar, the Americans faced one of the most formidable opponents of the war. A 5th-generation samurai, handpicked and personally extolled by the Emperor, Kuribayashi combined combat experience with an innovative mind and an iron will. Although this would be his only combat against American forces, he had learned much about his prospective opponents from earlier service in the United States. More significantly, he could appraise with an unblinking eye the results of previous Japanese attempts to repel American invasions of Japanese-held garrisons. Heroic rhetoric aside, Kuribayashi saw little to commend the defend-at-the-water's-edge tactics and all-or-nothing banzai attacks which had characterized Japan's failures from Tarawa to Tinian. Kuribayashi, a realist, also knew not to expect much help from Japan's depleted fleet and air forces. His best chances, he concluded, would be to maximize Iwo's forbidding terrain with a defense in depth along the pattern of the recent Bayak and Peleliu defensive efforts. He would eschew coast defense, anti-landing, and bonsai tactics and instead conduct a prolonged battle of attrition, a war of nerves, patience, and time. Possibly the Americans would lose heart and abandon the campaign. Such a seemingly passive policy, even that late in the war, seemed revolutionary to senior Japanese Army and Navy leaders. It ran counter to the deeply ingrained warrior code, which viewed the defensive as only an unpleasant interim pending resumption of the glorious offensive in which one could destroy the enemy with sword and bayonet. Even Imperial General Headquarters grew nervous. There is some evidence of a top-level request for guidance in defending against American storm landings from Nazi Germany, whose sad experience in trying to defend Normandy at the water's edge had proven disastrous. The Japanese remained unconvinced. Kuribayashi needed every bit of his top connections with the emperor to keep from being summarily relieved for his radical proposals. His was not a complete organizational victory. The Navy insisted on building gun casements and blockhouses along the obvious landing beaches on Iwo, but in general he prevailed. Kuribayashi demanded the assistance of the finest mining engineers and fortification specialists in the empire. Here again the island favored the defender. Iwo's volcanic sand mixed readily with cement to produce superior concrete for installations. The soft rock lent itself to rapid digging. Half the garrison lay aside their weapons to labor with pick and spade. When American heavy bombers from the 7th Air Force commenced a daily pounding of the island in early December 1944, Kuribayashi simply moved everything, weapons, command posts, barracks, aid stations, underground. These engineering achievements were remarkable. Masked gun positions provided interlocking fields of fire. Miles of tunnels linked key defensive positions. Every cave featured multiple outlets and ventilation tubes. One installation inside Mount Suribachi ran 7 stories deep. The Americans would rarely see a live Japanese on Iwo Jima until the bitter end. American intelligence experts, aided by documents captured in Saipan and by an almost daily flow of aerial photography and periscope-level pictures from the submarine Spearfish, puzzled over the disappearing act of the Japanese garrison. Trained photo interpreters using stereoscopic lenses listed nearly 700 potential targets, but all were hardened, covered, masked. The intelligence staffs knew there was no fresh water available on the island. They could see the rainwater cisterns, and they knew what the average monthly rainfall would deliver. They concluded the garrison could not possibly survive under those conditions in numbers greater than 12,000 or 13,000. But Kuribayashi's force was twice that size. The men existed on half rations of water for months before the battle began. Unlike earlier amphibious assaults at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, the Americans would not enjoy either strategic or tactical surprise at Iwo Jima. Japanese strategists concluded Iwo Jima would be invaded soon after the loss of the Marianas. 6 months before the battle, Kuribayashi wrote his wife, "The Americans will surely invade this Iwo Jima. Do not look for my return." He worked his men ruthlessly to complete all defensive and training preparations by 11 February 1945, and met the objective. His was a mixed force of veterans and recruits, soldiers and sailors. His artillerymen and mortar crews were among the best in the empire. Regardless, he trained and disciplined them all. As the Americans soon discovered, each fighting position contained the commander's courageous battle vows, prominently posted above the firing apertures. Troops were admonished to maintain their positions and exact 10 American lives for every Japanese death. General Schmidt issued VAC Operation Plan 5-44 on 23 December 1944. The plan offered nothing fancy. Mount Suribachi dominated both potential beaches, but the 3,000 yards of black sand along the southeastern coast appeared more sheltered from the prevailing winds. Here the 5 Amphibious Corps would land on D-Day, the 4th Marine Division on the right, the 5th on the left, the 3rd in reserve. The initial objectives included the lower airfield, the west coast, and Suribachi. Then the force would swing into line and attack north, shoulder to shoulder. Anticipation of a major Japanese counterattack the first night influenced the landing plan. "We welcome a counterattack," said Holland Smith. "That's generally when we break their backs." Both Schmidt and the 4th Marine Division commander, Major General Clifton B. Cates, knew from recent experience at Tinian how capable the Japanese were at assembling large reserves at potential soft points along a fresh beachhead. The assault divisions would plan to land their artillery regiments before dark on D-Day in that contingency. The physical separation of the three divisions, from Guam to Hawaii, had no adverse effect on preparatory training. Where it counted most, the proficiency of small units in amphibious landings and combined arms assaults on fortified positions, each division was well prepared for the forthcoming invasion. The 3rd Marine Division had just completed its participation in the successful recapture of Guam. Field training often extended to active combat patrols to root out die-hard Japanese survivors. In Maui, the 4th Marine Division prepared for its 4th major assault landing in 13 months with quiet confidence, recalled Major Frederick J. Karch, operations officer for the 14th Marines. "We had a continuity there of veterans that was just unbeatable." In neighboring Hawaii, the 5th Marine Division calmly prepared for its first combat experience. The unit's newness would prove misleading. Well above half of the officers and men were veterans, including a number of former Marine parachutists and a few raiders who had first fought in the Solomons. Lieutenant Colonel Don J. Robertson took command of the 3rd Battalion 27th Marines barely 2 weeks before embarkation and immediately ordered it into the field for a sustained live-firing exercise. Its competence and confidence impressed him. These were professionals, he concluded. Among the veterans preparing for Iwo Jima were 2 Medal of Honor recipients from the Guadalcanal campaign, Gunnery Sergeant John Manila John Basilone and Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Galler. Headquarters Marine Corps preferred to keep such distinguished veterans in the States for morale purposes, but both men wrangled their way back overseas, Basilone leading a machine gun platoon, Galler delivering a new radar unit for employment with the Landing Force Air Support Control Unit. The Guadalcanal veterans would only shake their heads at the abundance of amphibious shipping available for Operation Detachment. Admiral Turner would command 495 ships, of which fully 140 were amphibiously configured, the whole array 10 times the size of Guadalcanal's task force. Still, there were problems. So many of the ships and crews were new that each rehearsal featured embarrassing collisions and other accidents. The new TD-18 bulldozers were found to be an inch too wide for the medium landing craft, LCMs. The newly modified M4A3 Sherman tanks proved so heavy that the LCMs rode with dangerously low freeboards. Likewise, 105mm howitzers overloaded the amphibious trucks, DUKWs, to the point of near unseaworthiness. These factors would prove costly in Iwo's unpredictable surf zone. These problems notwithstanding, the huge force embarked and began the familiar move to westward. Said Colonel Robert E. Hogaboom, Chief of Staff 3rd Marine Division. "We were in good shape, well-trained, well-equipped, and thoroughly supported." On Iwo Jima, General Kuribayashi had benefited from the American postponements of Operation Detachment because of delays in the Philippines campaign. He too felt as ready and prepared as possible. When the American Armada sailed from the Marianas on 13 February, he was forewarned. He deployed 1 infantry battalion in the vicinity of the beaches and lower airfield, ordered the bulk of his garrison into its assigned fighting holes, and settled down to await the inevitable storm. 2 contentious issues divided the Navy Marine team as D-Day at Iwo Jima loomed closer. The first involved Admiral Spruance's decision to detach Task Force 58, the fast carriers under Admiral Mark Mitcher, to attack strategic targets on Honshu simultaneously with the onset of Admiral Blandy's preliminary bombardment of Iwo. The Marines suspected Navy-Air Force rivalry at work here. Most of Mitcher's targets were aircraft factories which the B-29s had missed badly a few days earlier. What the Marines really begrudged was Mitchell taking all 8 Marine Corps fighter squadrons assigned to the fast carriers, plus the new fast battleships with their 16-inch guns. Task Force 58 returned to Iwo in time to render sparkling support with these assets on D-Day, but 2 days later it was off again, this time for good. The other issue was related, and it concerned the continuing argument between senior Navy and Marine officers over the extent of preliminary naval gunfire. The Marines looked at the intelligence reports on Iwo and requested 10 days of preliminary fire. The Navy said it had neither the time nor the ammo to spare. 3 days would have to suffice. Holland Smith and Harry Schmidt continued to plead, finally offering to compromise to 4 days. Turner deferred to Spruance, who ruled that 3 days prep fire, in conjunction with the daily pounding being administered by the 7th Air Force, would do the job. Lieutenant Colonel Donald M. Weller, USMC, served as the FMF-PAC Task Force 51 Naval Gunfire Officer, and no one in either sea service knew the business more thoroughly. Weller had absorbed the lessons of the Pacific War well, especially those of the conspicuous failures at Tarawa. The issue, he argued forcibly to Admiral Turner, was not the weight of the shells nor their caliber, but rather time. Destruction of heavily fortified enemy targets took deliberate, pinpoint firing from close ranges, assessed and adjusted by aerial observers. Iwo Jima's 700 hard targets would require time to knock out, a lot of time. Neither Spruance nor Turner had time to give, for strategic, tactical, and logistical reasons. 3 days of firing by Admiral Blandy's sizable bombardment force would deliver 4 times the amount of shells Tarawa received, and 1.5 times that delivered against larger Saipan. It would have to do. In effect, Iwo's notorious foul weather, the imperviousness of many of the Japanese fortifications, and other distractions dissipated even the 3 days bombardment. We got about 13 hours worth of fire support during the 34 hours of available daylight, complained Brigadier General William W. Rogers, Chief of Staff to General Schmidt. The Americans received an unexpected bonus when General Kuribayashi committed his only known tactical error during the battle. This occurred on D-2 as a force of 100 Navy and Marine Underwater Demolition Team, UDT, frogmen bravely approached the eastern beaches escorted by a dozen LCI landing craft firing their guns and rockets. Kuribayashi evidently believed this to be the main landing and authorized the coastal batteries to open fire. The exchange was hot and heavy, with the LCIs getting the worst of it, but U.S. battleships and cruisers hurried in to blast the casement guns suddenly revealed on the slopes of Suribachi and along the rock quarry on the right flank. That night, gravely concerned about the hundreds of Japanese targets still untouched by 2 days of firing, Admiral Blandy conducted a council of war on board his flagship. At Weller's suggestion, Blandy junked the original plan and directed his gunships to concentrate exclusively on the beach areas. This was done with considerable effect on D-1 and D-Day morning itself. Kuribayashi noted that most of the positions the Imperial Navy insisted on building along the beach approaches had in fact been destroyed, as he had predicted. Yet his main defensive belts crisscrossing the Motoyama Plateau remained intact. "I pray for a heroic fight," he told his staff. On board Admiral Turner's flagship, the press briefing held the night before D-Day was uncommonly somber. General Holland Smith predicted heavy casualties, possibly as many as 15,000, which shocked all hands. A man clad in khakis without rank insignia then stood up to address the room. It was James V. Forrestal, Secretary of the Navy. "Iwo Jima, like Tarawa, leaves very little choice," he said quietly, "except to take it by force of arms, by character and courage." The Japanese commander. In the estimation of Lieutenant Colonel Justice M. Chambers, USMC, a battalion commander, 325, whose 4 days ashore resulted in the Purple Heart and the Medal of Honor, on Iwo Jima, one of their smartest generals commanded, a man who did not believe in the bonsai business. Each Jap was to kill 10 Marines. For a while they were beating their quotas. Chambers was describing Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, Imperial Japanese Army Commanding General, 109th Division, and Commander Ogasawara Army Group. The U.S. Marines have rarely faced a tougher opponent. Kuribayashi, 53, a native of Nagano Prefecture, had served the emperor as a cavalry officer since graduating from the military academy in 1914. He spent several years as a junior officer posted to the Japanese embassies in America and Canada. With the advent of war in Asia, Kuribayashi commanded a cavalry regiment in combat in Manchuria and a brigade in northern China. Later, he served as Chief of Staff to the 23rd Army during the capture of Hong Kong. Favored by the Emperor, he returned from China to command the Imperial Guards Division in Tokyo. After the fall of Saipan in June 1944, he was assigned to command the defensive fortress of Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi was a realist. He saw Iwo Jima's crude airstrips as a net liability to the Empire, at best providing nuisance raids against the B-29s, certain to draw the attention of American strategic planners. Iwo Jima's airfields in American hands would pose an enormous threat to Japan. Kuribayashi saw only two options: either blow up the entire island, which proved infeasible, or defend it to the death. To do the latter effectively, he adapted a radical defensive policy, foregoing the water's edge linear tactics and suicidal banzai attacks of previous island battles. This stirred controversy at the highest levels. Imperial headquarters even asked the Nazis for advice on repelling American invasions, as well as among Kuribayashi's own officers. Kuribayashi made some compromises with the semi-independent naval forces on the island, but sacked 18 senior army officers, including his own chief of staff. Those who remained would implement their commander's policy to the letter. Doomed without naval or air support, Kuribayashi nevertheless proved to be a resolute and resourceful field commander. His only tactical error was to authorize the sector commander to engage the U.S. task force covering underwater demolitions team operations on D-2. This became a gift to the attackers, for it revealed to American gunners the previously masked batteries which otherwise would have slaughtered the assault waves on D-Day. Japanese accounts indicate Kuribayashi committed harakiri, the Japanese ritual suicide, in his cave near Kitano Point on 23 March 1945, the 33rd day of the battle. "Of all our adversaries in the Pacific," said General Holland M. Smith, USMC, "Kuribayashi was the most redoubtable." Said another Marine, "Let's hope the Japs don't have any more like him." D-Day. Weather conditions around Iwo Jima on D-Day morning, 19 February 1945, were almost ideal. At 06:45, Admiral Turner signaled, "Land the landing force." Shore bombardment ships did not hesitate to engage the enemy island at near point-blank range. Battleships and cruisers steamed as close as 2,000 yards to level their guns against island targets. Many of the old battleships had performed this dangerous mission in all theaters of the war. Marines came to recognize and appreciate their contributions. It seemed fitting that the old Nevada, raised from the muck and ruin of Pearl Harbor, should lead the bombardment force close ashore. Marines also admired the battleship Arkansas, built in 1912, and recently returned from the Atlantic, where she had battered German positions at Pointe du Hoc at Normandy during the epic Allied landing on 6 June 1944. Lieutenant Colonels Weller and William W. Bucky Buchanan, both artillery officers, had devised a modified form of the rolling barrage for use by the bombarding gunships against beachfront targets just before H-hour. This concentration of naval gunfire would advance progressively as the troops landed, always remaining 400 yards to their front. Air spotters would help regulate the pace. Such an innovation appealed to the three division commanders, each having served in France during World War I. In those days, a good rolling barrage was often the only way to break a stalemate. The shelling was terrific. Admiral Hill would later boast that there were no proper targets for shore bombardment remaining on Dog Day morning. This proved to be an overstatement, yet no one could deny the unprecedented intensity of firepower Hill had delivered against the area surrounding the landing beaches. As General Kuribayashi would ruefully admit in an assessment report to Imperial General Headquarters, "We need to reconsider the power of bombardment from ships. The violence of the enemy's bombardments is far beyond description." The amphibious task force appeared from over the horizon, the rails of the troop ships crowded with combat-equipped Marines watching the spectacular fireworks. The Guadalcanal veterans among them realized a grim satisfaction watching American battleships leisurely pounding the island from just offshore. The war had come full cycle from the dark days of October 1942, when the 1st Marine Division and the Cactus Air Force endured similar shelling from Japanese battleships. The Marines and sailors were anxious to get their first glimpse of the objective. Correspondent John P. Marquand, the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, recorded his own first impressions of Iwo. Its silhouette was like a sea monster, with the little dead volcano for the head and the beach area for the neck, and all the rest of it, with its scrubby brown cliffs for the body. Lieutenant David N. Suskind, U.S. Navy Reserve, wrote down his initial thoughts from the bridge of the troopship Malay. Iwo Jima was a rude, ugly sight. Only a geologist could look at it and not be repelled. As described in a subsequent letter home by Navy Lieutenant Michael F. Kelleher, a surgeon in the 25th Marines. The naval bombardment had already begun, and I could see the orange-yellow flashes as the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers blasted away at the island broadside. Yes, there was Iwo, surprisingly close, just like the pictures and models we had been studying for 6 weeks. The volcano was to our left, then the long, flat, black beaches where we were going to land, and the rough rocky plateau to our right. The commanders of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, Major Generals Clifton B. Cates and Keller E. Rocky, respectively, studied the island through binoculars from their respective ships. Each division would land 2 reinforced regiments abreast. From left to right, the beaches were designated green, red, yellow, and blue. The 5th Division would land the 28th Marines on the left flank, over Green Beach, the 27th Marines over Red. The 4th Division would land the 23rd Marines over Yellow Beach and the 25th Marines over Blue Beach on the right flank. General Schmidt reviewed the latest intelligence reports with growing uneasiness and requested a reassignment of reserve forces with General Smith. The 3rd Marine Division's 21st Marines would replace the 26th Marines as Corps Reserve, thus releasing the latter regiment to the 5th Division. Schmidt's landing plan envisioned the 28th Marines cutting the island in half, then turning to capture Suribachi, while the 25th Marines would scale the rock quarry and then serve as the hinge for the entire Corps to swing around to the north. The 23rd Marines and 27th Marines would capture the first airfield and pivot north within their assigned zones. General Cates was already concerned about the right flank. Blue Beach 2 lay directly under the observation and fire of suspected Japanese positions in the rock quarry, whose steep cliffs overshadowed the right flank like Suribachi dominated the left. The 4th Marine Division figured that the 25th Marines would have the hardest objective to take on D-Day. Said Cates, "If I knew the name of the man on the extreme right of the right-hand squad, I'd recommend him for a medal before we go in." The choreography of the landing continued to develop. Iwo Jima would represent the pinnacle of forcible amphibious assault against a heavily fortified shore, a complex art mastered painstakingly by the 5th Fleet over many campaigns. 7th Air Force Martin B. 24 Liberator bombers flew in from the Marianas to strike the smoking island. Rocket ships moved in to saturate nearshore targets. Then it was time for the fighter and attack squadrons from Mitcher's Task Force 58 to contribute. The Navy pilots showed their skills at bombing and strafing, but the troops naturally cheered the most at the appearance of the F-4U Corsairs flown by Marine Fighter Squadrons 124 and 213, led by Lieutenant Colonel William A. Millington from the fleet carrier Essex. Colonel Vernon E. Meggie, in his shipboard capacity as air officer for General Smith's Expeditionary Troops staff, had urged Millington to put on a special show for the troops in the assault waves. "Drag your bellies on the beach," he told Millington. The Marine fighters made an impressive approach parallel to the island, then virtually did Maggie's bidding, streaking low over the beaches, strafing furiously. The geography of the Pacific War since Bougainville had kept many of the ground Marines separated from their own air support, which had been operating in areas other than where they had been fighting, most notably the Central Pacific. "It was the first time a lot of them had ever seen a Marine fighter plane," said Meggie. "The troops were not disappointed." The planes had barely disappeared when naval gunfire resumed, carpeting the beach areas with a building crescendo of high explosive shells. The ship-to-shore movement was well underway, an easy 30-minute run for the tracked landing vehicles, LVTs. This time there were enough LVTs to do the job. 68 LVT-A4 armored Amtraks mounting snub-nosed 75mm cannon leading the way, followed by 380 troop-laden LVT-4s and LVT-2s. The waves crossed the line of departure on time and chugged confidently towards the smoking beaches, all the while under the climactic bombardment from the ships. Here there was no coral reef, no killer neap tides to be concerned with. The Navy and Marine frogmen had reported the approaches free of mines or tetrahedrons. There was no premature cessation of fire. The rolling barrage plan took effect. Hardly a vehicle was lost to the desultory enemy fire. The massive assault waves hit the beach within 2 minutes of H-hour. A Japanese observer watching the drama unfold from a cave on the slopes of Suribachi reported, "At 9 o'clock in the morning, several hundred landing craft with amphibious tanks in the lead rushed ashore like an enormous tidal wave." Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Williams, executive officer of the 28th Marines, recalled that the landing was a magnificent sight to see. 2 divisions landing abreast. You could see the whole show from the deck of a ship. To this point, so far, so good. The first obstacle came not from the Japanese, but the beach and the parallel terraces. Iwo Jima was an emerging volcano. Its steep beaches dropped off sharply, producing a narrow but violent surf zone. The soft black sand immobilized all-wheel vehicles and caused some of the tracked amphibians to belly down. The boat waves that closely followed the LVTs had more trouble. Ramps would drop, a truck or jeep would attempt to drive out, only to get stuck. In short order, a succession of plunging waves hit the stalled craft before they could completely unload, filling their sterns with water and sand, broaching them broadside. The beach quickly resembled a salvage yard. The infantry, heavily laden, found its own foot mobility severely restricted. In the words of Corporal Edward Hartman, a rifleman with the 4th Marine Division, the sand was so soft it was like trying to run in loose coffee grounds. From the 28th Marines came this early, laconic report: resistance moderate, terrain awful. The rolling barrage and carefully executed landing produced the desired effect, suppressing direct enemy fire, providing enough shock and distraction to enable the first assault waves to clear the beach and begin advancing inward. Within minutes, 6,000 Marines were ashore. Many became thwarted by increasing fire over the terraces or down from the highlands, but hundreds leapt forward to maintain assault momentum. The 28th Marines on the left flank had rehearsed on similar volcanic terrain on the island of Hawaii. Now, despite increasing casualties among their company commanders and the usual disorganization of landing, elements of the regiment used their initiative to strike across the narrow neck of the peninsula. The going became progressively costly as more and more Japanese strongpoints along the base of Suribachi seemed to spring to life. Within 90 minutes of the landing, however, elements of the 1st Battalion 28th Marines had reached the western shore, 700 yards across from Green Beach. Iwo Jima had been severed, like cutting off a snake's head, in the words of one Marine. It would represent the deepest penetration of what was becoming a very long and costly day. The other 3 regiments experienced difficulty leaving the black sand terraces and wheeling across towards the first airfield. The terrain was an open bowl, a shooting gallery in full view from Suribachi on the left and the rising tableland to the right. Any thoughts of a cakewalk quickly vanished as well-directed machine gun fire whistled across the open ground and mortar rounds began dropping along the terraces. Despite these difficulties, the 27th Marines made good initial gains, reaching the southern and western edges of the first airfield before noon. The 23rd Marines landed over Yellow Beach and sustained the brunt of the first round of Japanese combined arms fire. These troops crossed the second terrace only to be confronted by 2 huge concrete pillboxes, still lethal despite all the pounding. Overcoming these positions proved costly in casualties and time. More fortified positions appeared in the broken ground beyond. Colonel Walter W. Wensinger's call for tank support could not be immediately honored because of trafficability and congestion problems on the beach. The regiment clawed its way several hundred yards towards the eastern edge of the airstrip. No assault units found it easy going to move inland, but the 25th Marines almost immediately ran into a buzzsaw trying to move across Blue Beach. General Cates had been right in his appraisal. That right flank was a bitch if there ever was one, he would later say. Lieutenant Colonel Hollis W. Mustaine's 1st Battalion 25th Marines managed to scratch forward 300 yards under heavy fire in the first half hour, but Lieutenant Colonel Chambers' 3rd Battalion 25th Marines took the heaviest beating of the day on the extreme right, trying to scale the cliffs leading to the rock quarry. Chambers landed 15 minutes after H hour. Crossing that second terrace, he recalled, the fire from automatic weapons was coming from all over. You could have held up a cigarette and lit it on the stuff going by. I knew immediately we were in for one hell of a time. This was simply the beginning. While the assault forces tried to overcome the infantry weapons of the local defenders, they were naturally blind to an almost imperceptible stirring taking place among the rocks and crevices of the interior highlands. With grim anticipation, General Kuribayashi's gunners began unmasking the big guns. The heavy artillery, giant mortars, rockets, and anti-tank weapons held under tightest discipline for this precise moment. Kuribayashi had patiently waited until the beaches were clogged with troops and material. Gun crews knew the range and deflection to each landing beach by heart. All weapons had been pre-registered on these targets long ago. At Kuribayashi's signal, these hundreds of weapons began to open fire. It was shortly after 1000. The ensuing bombardment was as deadly and terrifying as any of the Marines had ever experienced. There was hardly any cover. Japanese artillery and mortar rounds blanketed every corner of the 3,000-yard-wide beach. Large-caliber coast defense guns and dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns firing horizontally added a deadly scissors of direct fire from the high ground on both flanks. Marines stumbling over the terraces to escape the rain of projectiles encountered the same disciplined machine gun fire and minefields which had slowed the initial advance. Casualties mounted appallingly. 2 Marine combat veterans observing this expressed a grudging admiration for the Japanese gunners. It was one of the worst bloodlettings of the war, said Major Karch of the 14th Marines. They rolled those artillery barrages up and down the beach. I just didn't see how anybody could live through such heavy fire barrages. Said Lieutenant Colonel Joseph L. Stewart, the Japanese were superb artillerymen. Somebody was getting hit every time they fired. At sea, Lieutenant Colonel Weller tried desperately to deliver naval gunfire against the Japanese gun positions shooting down at 3rd Battalion 25th Marines from the rock quarry. It would take longer to coordinate this fire. The first Japanese barrages had wiped out the 3rd Battalion 25th Marines' entire shore fire control party. As the Japanese firing reached a general crescendo, the 4 assault regiments issued dire reports to the flagship. Within a 10-minute period, these messages crackled over the command net. 10:36 from 25th Marines. Catching all hell from the quarry, heavy mortar and machine gun fire. 10:39 from 23rd Marines. Taking heavy casualties and can't move for the moment. Mortars killing us. 10:42 from 27th Marines. All units pinned down by artillery and mortars. Casualties heavy. Need tank support fast to move anywhere. 10:46 from 28th Marines. Taking heavy fire and forward movement stopped. Machine gun and artillery fire heaviest ever seen. The landing force suffered and bled but did not panic. The profusion of combat veterans throughout the rank and file of each regiment helped the rookies focus on the objective. Communications remained effective. Keen-eyed aerial observers spotted some of the now exposed gun positions and directed naval gunfire effectively. Carrier planes screeched in low to drop napalm canisters. The heavy Japanese fire would continue to take an awful toll throughout the first day and night, but it would never again be so murderous as that first unholy hour. Marine Sherman tanks played hell getting into action on D-Day. Later in the battle, these combat vehicles would be the most valuable weapons on the battlefield for the Marines. This day was a nightmare. The assault divisions embarked many of their tanks on board medium landing ships, LSMs, sturdy little craft that could deliver 5 Shermans at a time. But it was tough disembarking them on Iwo's steep beaches. The stern anchors could not hold in the loose sand, Bow cables run forward to deadmen LVTs parted under the strain. On one occasion, the lead tank stalled at the top of the ramp, blocking the other vehicles and leaving the LSM at the mercy of the rising surf. Other tanks bogged down or threw tracks in the loose sand. Many of those that made it over the terraces were destroyed by huge horned mines or disabled by deadly accurate 47mm anti-tank fire from Suribachi. Other tankers kept coming. Their relative mobility, armored protection, and 75mm gunfire were most welcome to the infantry scattered among Iwo Jima's lunar-looking, shell-pocked landscape. Both division commanders committed their reserves early. General Rocky called in the 26th Marines shortly after noon. General Cates ordered 2 battalions of the 24th Marines to land at 1400. The 3rd Battalion 24th Marines followed several hours later. Many of the reserve battalions suffered heavier casualties crossing the beach than the assault units, a result of Kuribayashi's punishing bombardment from all points on the island. Mindful of the likely Japanese counterattack in the night to come, and despite the fire and confusion along the beaches, both divisions also ordered their artillery regiments ashore. This process, frustrating and costly, took much of the afternoon. The wind and surf began to pick up as the day wore on, causing more than one low-riding DUKW to swamp with its precious 105mm howitzer cargo. Getting the guns ashore was one thing. Getting them up off the sand was quite another. The 75mm pack howitzers fared better than the heavier 105s. Enough Marines could readily hustle them up over the terraces, albeit at great risk. The 105s seemed to have a mind of their own in the black sand. The effort to get each single weapon off the beach was a saga in its own right. Somehow, despite the fire and unforgiving terrain, both Colonel Louis G. DeHaven, commanding the 14th Marines, and Colonel James D. Waller, commanding the 13th Marines, managed to get batteries in place, registered, and rendering close fire support well before dark, a singular accomplishment. Japanese fire and the plunging surf continued to make a shambles out of the beachhead. Late in the afternoon, Lieutenant Michael F. Kelleher, U.S. Navy Reserve, the battalion surgeon, was ordered ashore to take over the 3rd Battalion 25th Marines aid station from its gravely wounded surgeon. Kelleher, a veteran of 3 previous assault landings, was appalled by the carnage on Blue Beach as he approached. Such a sight on that beach. Wrecked boats, bogged-down jeeps, tractors and tanks, burning vehicles, casualties scattered all over. On the left center of the action, leading his machine gun platoon in the 1st Battalion 27th Marines attack against the southern portion of the airfield, the legendary Manila John Basilone fell mortally wounded by a Japanese mortar shell, a loss keenly felt by all Marines on the island. Farther east, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Galler, the other Guadalcanal Medal of Honor Marine, and one of the Pacific War's earliest fighter aces, survived the afternoon's fusillade along the beaches and began reassembling his scattered radar unit in a deep shell hole near the base of Suribachi. Late in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Don J. Robertson led his 3rd Battalion 27th Marines ashore over Blue Beach, disturbed at the intensity of fire still being directed on the reserve forces this late on D-Day. "They were really ready for us," he recalled. He watched with pride and wonderment as his Marines landed under fire, took casualties, stumbled forward to clear the beach. What impels a young guy landing on a beach in the face of fire? He asked himself. Then it was Robertson's turn. His boat hit the beach too hard. The ramp wouldn't drop. Robertson and his command group had to roll over the gunwales into the churning surf and crawl ashore, an inauspicious start. The bitter battle to capture the rock quarry cliffs on the right flank raged all day. The beachhead remained completely vulnerable to enemy direct fire weapons from these heights. The Marines had to storm them before many more troops or supplies could be landed. In the end, it was the strength of character of Captain James Headley and Lieutenant Colonel Jumpin' Joe Chambers who led the survivors of the 3rd Battalion 25th Marines onto the top of the cliffs. The battalion paid an exorbitant price for this achievement, losing 22 officers and 500 troops by nightfall. The 2 assistant division commanders, Brigadier Generals Franklin A. Hart and Leo D. Hermele, of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions respectively, spent much of D-Day on board the control vessels marking both ends of the line of departure, 4,000 yards offshore. This reflected yet another lesson in amphibious techniques learned from Tarawa. Having senior officers that close to the ship-to-shore movement provided landing force decision-making from the most forward vantage point. By dusk, General Hermele opted to come ashore. At Tarawa, he had spent the night of D-Day essentially out of contact at the fire-swept pierhead. This time he intended to be on the ground. Hermele had the larger operational picture in mind, knowing the Corps commander's desire to force the reserves and artillery units on shore despite the carnage in order to build credible combat power. Hermele knew that whatever the night might bring, the Americans now had more troops on the island than Kuribayashi could ever muster. His presence helped his division forget about the day's disasters and focus on preparations for the expected counterattacks. Japanese artillery and mortar fire continued to rake the beachhead. The enormous spigot mortar shells, called flying ash cans by the troops, and rocket-boosted aerial bombs were particularly scary, loud, whistling projectiles tumbling end over end. Many sailed completely over the island. Those that hit along the beaches or the south runways invariably caused dozens of casualties with each impact. Few Marines could dig a proper foxhole in the granular sand, like trying to dig a hole in a barrel of wheat. Among urgent calls to the control ship for plasma, stretchers, and mortar shells came repeated cries for sandbags. Veteran Marine combat correspondent Lieutenant Cyril P. Zerlinden, soon to become a casualty himself, described that first night ashore. At Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian, I saw Marines killed and wounded in a shocking manner, but I saw nothing like the ghastliness that hung over the Iwo beachhead. Nothing any of us had ever known could compare with the utter anguish, frustration, and constant inner battle to maintain some semblance of sanity. Personnel accounting was a nightmare under those conditions, but the assault divisions eventually reported the combined loss of 2,420 men to General Schmidt. 501 killed, 1,755 wounded, 47 dead of wounds, 18 missing, and 99 combat fatigue. These were sobering statistics, but Schmidt now had 30,000 Marines ashore. The casualty rate of 8% left the landing force in relatively better condition than at the first days at Tarawa or Saipan. The miracle was that the casualties had not been twice as high. General Kuribayashi had possibly waited a little too long to open up with his big guns. The first night on Iwo was ghostly. Sulfuric mist spiraled out of the earth. The Marines, used to the tropics, shivered in the cold, waiting for Kuribayashi's warriors to come screaming down from the hills. They would learn that this Japanese commander was different. There would be no wasteful, vainglorious banzai attack, this night or any other. Instead, small teams of infiltrators, which Kuribayashi termed prowling wolves, probed the lines, gathering intelligence. A barge full of Japanese special landing forces tried a small counter-landing on the western beaches and died to the man under the alert guns of the 28th Marines and its supporting LVT crews. Otherwise, the night was one of continuing waves of indirect fire from the highlands. One high-velocity round landed directly in the hole occupied by the 1st Battalion 23rd Marines commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Haas, killing him instantly. The Marines took casualties throughout the night. But with the first streaks of dawn, the veteran landing force stirred. 5 infantry regiments looked north. A 6th turned to the business at hand in the south, Mount Suribachi. The assault commanders at Iwo Jima. 4 veteran Marine Major Generals led the sustained assault on Iwo Jima. Harry Schmidt, commanding General 5 Amphibious Corps, Graves B. Erskine, CG 3rd Marine Division, Clifton B. Cates, CG 4th Marine Division, and Keller E. Rocky, CG 5th Marine Division. Each would receive the Distinguished Service Medal for inspired combat leadership in this epic battle. General Schmidt was 58 at Iwo Jima and had served the Corps for 36 years. He was a native of Holdridge, Nebraska, and attended Nebraska Normal College. Expeditionary assignments kept him from service in World War I, but Schmidt saw considerable small unit action in Guam, China, the Philippines, Mexico, Cuba, and Nicaragua, plus 4 years at sea. He attended the Army Command and General Staff College and the Marine Corps Field Officers Course. In World War II, General Schmidt commanded the 4th Marine Division in the Roy Namur and Saipan operations, then assumed command of 5 Amphibious Corps for the Tinian landing. At Iwo Jima, he would command the largest force of Marines ever committed to a single battle. It was the highest honor of my life, he said. General Erskine was 47 at Iwo Jima, one of the youngest major generals in the Corps. He had served 28 years on active duty by that time. A native of Columbia, Louisiana, he graduated from Louisiana State University, received a Marine Corps commission, and immediately deployed overseas for duty in World War I. As a platoon commander in the 6th Marines, Erskine saw combat at Belleau Wood, Château-Thierry, Soissons, and Saint-Mihiel, during which he was twice wounded and awarded the Silver Star. In the interwar years, he served in Haiti, Santo Domingo, Nicaragua, Cuba, and China. He attended the Army Infantry School and the Army Command and General Staff College. In World War II, Erskine was Chief of Staff to General Holland M. Smith during campaigns in the Aleutians, Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas. He assumed command of the 3rd Marine Division in October 1944. General Cates, 51 at Iwo, had also served the Corps during the previous 28 years. He was one of the few Marine Corps general officers who held combat command at the platoon, company, battalion, regiment, and division levels in his career. Cates was born in Tiptonville, Tennessee, and attended the University of Tennessee. In World War I, he served as a junior officer in the 6th Marines at Belleau Wood, Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, and Blanc-Mont, and was awarded the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts for his service and his wounds. Between wars, he served at sea and twice in China. He attended the Army Industrial College, the senior course at Marine Corps schools, and the Army War College. In World War II, he commanded the 1st Marines at Guadalcanal and the 4th Marine Division at Tinian. 3 years after Iwo Jima, General Cates became the 19th Commandant of the Marine Corps. General Rocky was 56 at Iwo Jima and a veteran of 31 years of service to the Corps. He was born in Columbia City, Indiana, graduated from Gettysburg College, and studied at Yale. Like his fellow division commanders, Rocky served in France in World War I. He was awarded the Navy Cross as a junior officer in the 5th Marines at Château-Thierry. A 2nd Navy Cross came later for heroic service in Nicaragua. He also served in Haiti and 2 years at sea. He attended the Field Officers Course at Quantico and the Army Command and General Staff Course. He spent the first years of World War II at Headquarters Marine Corps in Washington, first as Director, Division of Plans and Policies, then as Assistant Commandant. In February 1944, General Rocky assumed command of the 5th Marine Division and began preparing the new organization for its first and last great battle of the war. 3 Marine Brigadier Generals also played significant roles in the amphibious seizure of Iwo Jima. William W. Rogers, Corps Chief of Staff, Franklin A. Hart, Assistant Division Commander, 4th Marine Division, and Leo D. Hermley, Assistant Division Commander, 5th Marine Division. Suribachi. The Japanese called the dormant volcano Suribachi Yama. The Marines dubbed it Hot Rocks. From the start, the Marines knew their drive north would never succeed without first seizing that hulking rock dominating the southern plain. Suribachi seemed to take on a life of its own, to be watching these men looming over them, recalled one observer, adding, "The mountain represented to these Marines a thing more evil than the Japanese." Colonel Kanehiko Atsuki commanded the 2,000 soldiers and sailors of the Suribachi garrison. The Japanese had honeycombed the mountain with gun positions, machine gun nests, observation sites, and tunnels, but Atsuki had lost many of his large-caliber guns in the direct naval bombardment of the preceding 3 days. General Kuribayashi considered Atsuki's command to be semi-autonomous, realizing the invaders would soon cut communications across the island's narrow southern tip. Kuribayashi nevertheless hoped Suribachi could hold out for 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. Some of Suribachi's stoutest defenses existed down low, around the rubble-strewn base. Here, nearly 70 camouflaged concrete blockhouses protected the approaches to the mountain. Another 50 bulged from the slopes within the first 100 feet of elevation. Then came the caves, the first of hundreds the Marines would face on Iwo Jima. The 28th Marines had suffered nearly 400 casualties in cutting across the neck of the island on D-Day. On D+1, in cold rain, they prepared to assault the mountain. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion 28th Marines, set the tone for the morning as he deployed his tired troops forward. "It's going to be a hell of a day in a hell of a place to fight the damned war." Some of the 105mm batteries of the 13th Marines opened up in support, firing directly overhead. Gun crews fired from positions hastily dug in the black sand directly next to the 28th Marines command post. Regimental Executive Officer Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Williams watched the cannoneers fire at Suribachi, 800 yards away over open sights. As the Marines would learn during their drive north, even 105mm howitzers would hardly shiver the concrete pillboxes of the enemy. As the prep fire lifted, the infantry leapt forward, only to run immediately into very heavy machine gun and mortar fire. Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge bellowed for his tanks. But the 5th Tank Battalion was already having a frustrating morning. The tankers sought a defilade spot in which to rearm and refuel for the day's assault. Such a location did not exist on Iwo Jima those first days. Every time tanks congregated to service their vehicles, they were hit hard by Japanese mortar and artillery fire from virtually the entire island. Getting sufficient vehicles serviced to join the assault took most of the morning. Hereafter, the tankers would maintain and re-equip their vehicles at night. This day's slow start led to more setbacks for the tankers. Japanese anti-tank gunners hiding in the jumbled boulders knocked out the first approaching Shermans. Assault momentum slowed further. The 28th Marines overran 40 strong points and gained roughly 200 yards all day. They lost a Marine for every yard gained. The tankers unknowingly redeemed themselves when one of their final 75mm rounds caught Colonel Atsuki as he peered out of a cave entrance, killing him instantly. Elsewhere, the morning light of D+1 revealed the discouraging sights of the chaos created along the beaches by the combination of Iwo Jima's wicked surf and Kuribayashi's unrelenting barrages. In the words of one dismayed observer, "The wreckage was indescribable. For 2 miles, the debris was so thick that there were only a few places where landing craft could still get in. The wrecked hulls of scores of landing boats testify to one price we had to pay to put our troops ashore. Tanks and half-tracks lay crippled where they had bogged down in the coarse sand. Amphibian tractors, victims of mines and well-aimed shells, lay flopped on their backs. Cranes brought ashore to unload cargo tilted at insane angles, and bulldozers were smashed in their own roadways. Bad weather set in, further compounding the problems of general unloading. Strong winds whipped sea swells into a nasty chop. The surf turned uglier. These were the conditions faced by Lieutenant Colonel Carl A. Youngdale in trying to land the 105mm howitzer batteries of his 4th Battalion 14th Marines. All 12 of these guns were preloaded into DUKWs, one to a vehicle. Added to the amphibious truck's problems of marginal seaworthiness with that payload was contaminated fuel. As Youngdale watched in horror, 8 DUKWs suffered engine failures, swamped, and sank with great loss of life. 2 more DUKWs broached in the surf zone, spilling their invaluable guns into deep water. At length, Youngdale managed to get his 2 remaining guns ashore and into firing position. General Schmidt also committed 1 battery of 155mm howitzers of the Corps' artillery to the narrow beachhead on D+1. Somehow these weapons managed to reach the beach intact, but it then took hours to get tractors to drag the heavy guns up over the terraces. These, too, commenced firing before dark, their deep bark a welcome sound to the infantry. Concern with the heavy casualties in the first 24 hours led Schmidt to commit the 21st Marines from Corps Reserve. The seas proved to be too rough. The troops had harrowing experiences trying to debark down cargo nets into the small boats bobbing violently alongside the transports. Several fell into the water. The boating process took hours. Once afloat, the troops circled endlessly in their small Higgins boats, waiting for the call to land. Wiser heads prevailed. After 6 hours of awful seasickness, the 21st Marines returned to its ships for the night. Even the larger landing craft, the LCTs and LSMs, had great difficulty beaching. Sea anchors needed to maintain the craft perpendicular to the breakers rarely held fast in the steep, soft bottom. Dropping those stern anchors was like dropping a spoon in a bowl of mush, said Admiral Hill. Hill contributed significantly to the development of amphibious expertise in the Pacific War. For Iwo Jima, he and his staff developed armored bulldozers to land in the assault waves. They also experimented with hinged Marston matting used for expeditionary airfields as a temporary roadway to get wheeled vehicles over the soft sand. On the beach at Iwo, the bulldozers proved to be worth their weights in gold. The Marston matting was only partially successful. LVTs kept chewing it up in passage, but all hands could see its potential. Admiral Hill also worked with the Naval Construction Battalion, NCB personnel, Seabees as they were called, in the attempt to bring supply-laden causeways and pontoon barges ashore. Again the surf prevailed, broaching the craft, spilling the cargo. In desperation, Hill's beachmasters turned to round-the-clock use of DUKWs and LVTs to keep combat cargo flowing. Once the DUKWs got free of the crippling load of 105mm howitzers, they did fine. LVTs were probably better because they could cross the soft beach without assistance and conduct resupply or medevac missions directly along the front lines. Both vehicles suffered from inexperienced LST crews in the transport area who too often would not lower their bow ramps to accommodate LVTs or DUKWs approaching after dark. In too many cases, vehicles loaded with wounded Marines thus rejected became lost in the darkness, ran out of gas, and sank. The amphibian tractor battalions lost 148 LVTs at Iwo Jima. Unlike Tarawa, Japanese gunfire and mines accounted for less than 20% of this total. 34 LVTs fell victim to Iwo's crushing surf, 88 sank in deep water, mostly at night. Once ashore and clear of the loose sand along the beaches, the tanks, half-tracks, and armored bulldozers of the landing force ran into the strongest minefield defenses yet encountered in the Pacific War. Under General Kuribayashi's direction, Japanese engineers had planted irregular rows of anti-tank mines and the now familiar horned anti-boat mines along all possible exits from both beaches. The Japanese supplemented these weapons by rigging enormous makeshift explosives from 500-pound aerial bombs, depth charges, and torpedo heads, each triggered by an accompanying pressure mine. Worse, Iwo's loose soil retained enough metallic characteristics to render the standard mine detectors unreliable. The Marines were reduced to using their own engineers on their hands and knees out in front of the tanks, probing for mines with bayonets and wooden sticks. While the 28th Marines fought to encircle Suribachi and the beachmasters and shore party attempted to clear the wreckage from the beaches, the remaining assault units of the VAC resumed their collective assault against Airfield No. 1. In the 5th Marine Division zone, the relatively fresh troops of the 1st Battalion 26th Marines and the 3rd Battalion 27th Marines quickly became bloodied in forcing their way across the western runways, taking heavy casualties from time-fused air bursts fired by Japanese dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns zeroed along the exposed ground. In the adjacent 4th Division zone, the 23rd Marines completed the capture of the airstrip, advancing 800 yards but sustaining high losses. Some of the bitterest fighting in the initial phase of the landing continued to occur along the high ground above the rock quarry on the right flank. Here the 25th Marines, reinforced by the 1st Battalion 24th Marines, engaged in literally the fight of its life. The Marines found the landscape and the Japanese embedded in it unreal. There was no cover from the enemy fire. Japs dug in reinforced concrete pillboxes laid down interlocking bands of fire that cut whole companies to ribbons. Camouflage hid all enemy positions. The high ground on either side was honeycombed with layer after layer of Jap emplacements. Their observation was perfect. Whenever a Marine made a move, the Japs would smother the area in a murderous blanket of fire. The second day of the battle had proven unsatisfactory on virtually every front. To cap off the frustration, when the 1st Battalion 24th Marines finally managed to break through along the cliffs late in the day, their only reward was 2 back-to-back cases of friendly fire. An American airstrike inflicted 11 casualties, Misguided salvos from an unidentified gunfire support ship took down 90 more. Nothing seemed to be going right. The morning of the third day, D+2 seemed to promise more of the same frustrations. Marines shivered in the cold wind and rain. Admiral Hill twice had to close the beach due to high surf and dangerous undertows. But during one of the grace periods, the 3rd Division's 21st Marines managed to come ashore, all of it extremely glad to be free of the heaving small boats. General Schmidt assigned it to the 4th Marine Division at first. The 28th Marines resumed its assault on the base of Suribachi, more slow, bloody fighting, seemingly boulder by boulder. On the west coast, the 1st Battalion 28th Marines made the most of field artillery and naval gunfire support to reach the shoulder of the mountain. Elsewhere, murderous Japanese fire restricted any progress to a matter of yards. Enemy mortar fire from all over the volcano rained down on the 2nd Battalion 28th Marines trying to advance along the eastern shore. Recalled Rifleman Richard Wheeler of the experience, "It was terrible, the worst I can remember us taking. The Jap mortarmen seemed to be playing checkers and using us as squares." The Marines used weasels, handy little tracked vehicles making their first field appearance in this battle, to hustle forward flamethrower canisters and evacuate some of the many wounded. That night, the amphibious task force experienced the only significant air attack of the battle. 50 kamikaze pilots from the 22nd Maitate Special Attack Unit left Katori Air Base near Yokosuka and flung themselves against the ships on the outer perimeter of Iwo Jima. In desperate action that would serve as a prelude to Okinawa's fiery engagements, the kamikazes sank the escort carrier Bismarck C with heavy loss of life and damaged several other ships, including the veteran Saratoga, finally knocked out of the war. All 50 Japanese planes were expended. It rained even harder on the 4th day, D+3. Marines scampering forward under fire would hit the deck, roll, attempt to return fire, only to discover that the loose volcanic grit had combined with the rain to jam their weapons. The 21st Marines, as the vanguard of the 3rd Marine Division, hoped for good fortune in its initial commitment after relieving the 23rd Marines. The regiment instead ran headlong into an intricate series of Japanese emplacements which marked the southeastern end of the main Japanese defenses. The newcomers fought hard all day to scratch and claw in advance of 200 net yards. Casualties were disproportionate. On the right flank, Lieutenant Colonel Chambers continued to rally the 3rd Battalion 25th Marines through the rough pinnacles above the rock quarry. As he strode about directing the advance of his decimated companies that afternoon, a Japanese gunner shot him through the chest. Chambers went down hard, thinking it was all over. I started fading in and out. I don't remember too much about it except the frothy blood gushing out of my mouth. Then somebody started kicking the hell out of my feet. It was Captain James Headley saying, "Get up, you are hurt worse on Tulagi." Captain Headley knew Chambers' sucking chest wound portended a grave injury. He sought to reduce his commander's shock until they could get him out of the line of fire. This took doing. Lieutenant Michael F. Kelleher, U.S. Navy Reserve, now the battalion surgeon, crawled forward with one of his corpsmen. Willing hands lifted Chambers on a stretcher. Kelleher and several others, bent double against the fire, carried him down the cliffs to the aid station and eventually on board a DUKW, making the evening's last run out to the hospital ships. All 3 battalion commanders in the 25th Marines had now become casualties. Chambers would survive to receive the Medal of Honor. Captain Headley would command the shot-up 3rd Battalion 25th Marines for the duration of the battle. By contrast, the 28th Marines on D+3 made commendable progress against Suribachi, reaching the shoulder at all points. Late in the day, combat patrols from the 1st Battalion 28th Marines and the 2nd Battalion 28th Marines linked up at Tobishi Point at the southern tip of the island. Recon patrols returned to tell Lieutenant Colonel Johnson that they found few signs of live Japanese along the mountain's upper slopes on the north side. At sundown, Admiral Spruance authorized Task Force 58 to strike Honshu and Okinawa, then retire to Ulithi to prepare for the Ryukyuan campaign. All 8 Marine Corps fighter squadrons thus left the Iwo Jima area for good. Navy pilots flying off the 10 remaining escort carriers would pick up the slack. Without slighting the skill and valor of these pilots, the quality of close air support to the troops fighting ashore dropped off after this date. The escort carriers, for one thing, had too many competing missions, namely combat air patrols, anti-submarine sweeps, searches for downed aviators, harassing strikes against neighboring Chichijima. Marines on Iwo Jima complained of slow response time to air support requests, light payloads, rarely greater than 100-pound bombs, and high delivery altitudes, rarely below 1,500 feet. The Navy pilots did deliver a number of napalm bombs. Many of these failed to detonate, although this was not the fault of the aviators. The early napalm bombs were simply old wing tanks filled with the mixture activated by unreliable detonators. The Marines also grew concerned about these notoriously inaccurate area weapons being dropped from high altitudes. By Friday, 23 February, D+4, the 28th Marines stood poised to complete the capture of Mount Suribachi. The honor went to the 3rd Platoon, reinforced, Company E, 2nd Battalion 28th Marines, under the command of 1st Lieutenant Harold G. Schreier, the company executive officer. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson ordered Schreier to scale the summit, secure the crater, and raise a 54-inch by 28-inch American flag for all to see. Schreier led his 40-man patrol forward at 0800. The regiment had done its job, blasting the dozens of pillboxes with flame and demolitions, rooting out snipers, knocking out the massed batteries. The combined arms pounding by planes, field pieces, and naval guns the past week had likewise taken its toll on the defenders. Those who remained popped out of their holes and caves to resist Schreier's advance, only to be cut down. The Marines worked warily up the steep northern slope, sometimes resorting to crawling on hands and knees. Part of the enduring drama of the Suribachi flag raising was the fact that it was observed by so many people. Marines all over the island could track the progress of the tiny column of troops during its ascent. "Those guys ought to be getting flight pay," said one wag. Likewise, hundreds of binoculars from the ships offshore watched Schreier's Marines climbing ever upward. Finally they reached the top and momentarily disappeared from view. Those closest to the volcano could hear distant gunfire. Then, at 10:20, there was movement on the summit. Suddenly the stars and stripes fluttered bravely. Lusty cheers rang out from all over the southern end of the island. The ships sounded their sirens and whistles. Wounded men propped themselves up on their litters to glimpse the sight. Strong men wept unashamedly. Navy Secretary Forrestal, thrilled by the sight, turned to Holland Smith and said, "The raising of that flag means a Marine Corps for another 500 years. 3 hours later, an even larger flag went up to more cheers. Few would know that Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had just captured the embodiment of the American warfighting spirit on film. Leatherneck magazine photographer Staff Sergeant Lou Lowry had taken a picture of the first flag raising and almost immediately got in a firefight with a couple of enraged Japanese. His photograph would become a valued collector's item, but Rosenthal's would enthrall the free world. Captain Thomas M. Fields, commanding Company D, 1st Battalion 26 Marines, heard his men yell, "Look up there," and turned in time to see the first flag go up. His first thought dealt with the battle still at hand. Thank God the Japs won't be shooting us down from behind anymore. Meanwhile, the 14th Marines rushed their echo and flash ranging equipment up to the summit. The landing force sorely needed enhanced counter-battery fire against Kuribayashi's big guns to the north. The Marines who raised the first flag were Lieutenant Schreier, Platoon Sergeant Ernest T. Thomas, Jr., Sergeant Henry O. Hansen, Corporal Charles W. Lindbergh, and Privates First Class Louis C. Charlo and James Mitchells. The 6 men immortalized by Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the second flag raising were Sergeant Michael Strank, Pharmacist Mate 2C John H. Bradley, Corporal Harlan H. Block, and Privates First Class Ira H. Hayes, Franklin R. Sousley, and Rene A. Gagnon. The 28th Marines took Suribachi in 3 days at the cost of more than 500 troops, added to its D-Day losses of 400 men. Colonel Liversedge began to reorient his regiment for operations in the opposite direction northward. Unknown to all, the battle still had another month to run its bloody course. Rosenthal's photograph of Iwo Jima flag raising quickly became one of the war's most famous. There were 2 flags raised over Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, but not at the same time. Despite the beliefs of many, and contrary to the supposed evidence, none of the photographs of the 2 flag raisings was posed. To begin with, early on the morning of 23 February 1945, 4 days after the initial landings, Captain Dave E. Severance, the commander of Company E, 2nd Battalion 28th Marines, ordered Lieutenant Harold G. Schreier to take a patrol and an American flag to the top of Suribachi. Staff Sergeant Lewis R. Lowry, a Leatherneck magazine photographer, accompanied the patrol. After a short firefight, the 54-inch by 28-inch flag was attached to a long piece of pipe found at the crest of the mountain and raised. This is the flag raising which Lowry photographed. As the flag was thought to be too small to be seen from the beach below, another Marine from the battalion went on board LST-779 to obtain a larger flag. A second patrol then took this flag up to Suribachi's top, and Joe Rosenthal, an Associated Press photographer who had just come ashore, accompanied it. As Rosenthal noted in his oral history interview, "My stumbling on that picture was, in all respects, accidental. When he got to the top of the mountain, he stood in a decline just below the crest of the hill with Marine Sergeant William Gnost, a movie cameraman who was killed later in the campaign, watching while a group of 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman fastened the new flag to another piece of pipe." Rosenthal said that he turned from Gnost and out of the corner of his eye saw the second flag being raised. He said, "Hey Bill, there it goes." He continued, "I swung my camera around and held it until I could guess that this was the peak of the action and shot." Some people learned that Rosenthal's photograph was of a second flag raising and made the accusation that it was posed. Joe Rosenthal: "Had I posed that shot, I would, of course, have ruined it. I would have also made them turn their heads so they could be identified for Associated Press members throughout the country, and nothing like the existing picture would have resulted." Later in the interview, he said, "This picture, what it means to me, and it has a meaning to me, that has to be peculiar only to me. I see all that blood running down the sand. I see those awful, impossible positions to take in a frontal attack on such an island where the batteries opposing you are not only staggered up in front of you, but also standing around at the sides as you're coming on shore. The awesome situation, before they ever reach that peak. Now, that a photograph can serve to remind us of the contribution of those boys. That was what made it important, not who took it." Rosenthal took 18 photographs that day, went down to the beach to write captions for his undeveloped film packs, and, as the other photographers on the island, sent his films out to the command vessel offshore. From there they were flown to Guam, where the headquarters of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Areas, was situated, and where the photos were processed and censored. Rosenthal's pictures arrived at Guam before Lowry's, were processed, sent to the States for distribution, and his flag-raising picture became one of the most famous photographs ever taken in the war, or in any war. Bennis M. Frank. The 6 men who participated in the second, or famous, flag-raising on Mount Suribachi were Marines, joined by a medical corpsman. They were Sergeant Michael Strank, Pharmacist Mate 2C John H. Bradley, U.S. Navy, Corporal Harlan H. Block, and PFCs Ira H. Hayes, Franklin R. Sousley, and Renee A. Gagnon. AP photographer Joe Rosenthal recalls stumbling on the picture accidentally. "I swung my camera around and held it until I could guess that this was the peak of the action and shot. Had I posed that shot, I would, of course, have ruined it. I would have also made them turn their heads so that they could be identified, and nothing like the existing picture would have resulted."